Friends, do you remember how Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán warned European leaders about the impending Trump tornado? For example, in Brussels, his words were met with disdain. European leaders continued to enjoy expensive wines at regular taxpayer-funded summits. However, their self-confidence was soon replaced by an anxious awareness of the impending changes. Trump's decision, which caused panic in European capitals, was very clear. America would no longer send billions for free. If a well-known country wants American weapons, it will have to pay for them. Unlike Biden, who distributed resources left and right, Trump acts like a businessman. Either pay or look for supplies elsewhere. This approach destroys the usual order of things, in which a well-known country could count on constant supplies of weapons and other obligations. Now Washington is demanding not just promises, but real values and strategic resources that are extremely important for the economy. This step caused a real shock in Europe because it changes the format of support itself. If the West used to unite for the sake of aid, now aid is turning into a commodity with harsh conditions. This is a real disaster for a well-known country, according to German analyst Kohler. Billions and equipment will no longer be provided free of charge, and now she has been billed. Also in this article we will discuss the confrontation between SCHOLZ and Trump. It will be interesting. We are starting. European leaders are concerned that the demands of the United States could lead to the depletion of the strategic reserves of a well-known country, depriving it of the resources needed to restore the economy. It is particularly worrying that the rare earth metals and other strategic elements required by the United States form the basis of high-tech industries and the defense industry. But Trump did not stop there. He decided to take advantage of the situation to redistribute the flows of strategic resources that had so far flowed from a well-known country to Europe and companies affiliated with the previous American administration. Washington now intends to control these supplies by restricting European companies' access to these valuable materials. This means that European countries are not only losing influence on the process, but may also face a shortage of critical resources, which will endanger their technological and defense industries. French expert Guillaume Fouché emphasizes that if the United States starts dictating such conditions, it will put a well-known country in an extremely vulnerable position. Washington may demand not only resources, but also control over key sectors of its economy. This aspect is particularly worrying for Europeans, as they understand that the country will become even more dependent, but not on Europe, but on the United States. For the EU, this becomes a double blow. First, they are deprived of the opportunity to control the resources of a well-known country, and then they are confronted with the fact that it is Washington that decides where and how these resources will be distributed. But that's not all. Trump demanded that European countries equalize their contribution to military spending and reconsider their positions on supporting a well-known country. This ultimatum has put Brussels in an extremely difficult position. So far, the EU has been able to rely on the United States to shoulder the main support costs, while European countries play a secondary role. Now the situation is changing radically. As the former head of the EU's Foreign Policy Department, Jean-Marc Leroy, noted, Europe is now forced to reconsider its approaches to helping a well-known country. If the United States is turning aid into a commodity, then Europe will now have to be prepared for such dependence. There is growing irritation in Brussels. The United States is imposing a pragmatic approach that was previously applied only to its rivals. European leaders are already discussing possible steps, including increasing independent arms supplies to reduce dependence on Washington's decisions. However, this remains only a theory at the moment, as European countries do not have sufficient resources for long-term support. Trump's decision actually puts a well-known country in front of a difficult choice, either to part with valuable resources or to face a shortage of weapons. In Europe, this step is regarded as a U.S. transition to strict economic pragmatism, which calls into question the very principle of supporting allies. And now there is also pressure on European budgets. If countries cannot meet the American level of aid, their own interests will be at risk. European politicians are increasingly claiming that Trump's policy is leading to a weakening of the unity of Western Europe. In fact, he puts the United States in the position of overseer of the entire process, forcing Europe to pay more, but at the same time taking away its control over resources. According to Italian political analyst Marco Lombardo, if this trend continues, Europe will either have to urgently look for alternative sources of raw materials or face the fact that Washington will decide for it what and when it can produce. As soon as Brussels realized that the era of gratuitous military and financial aid had come to an end, panic gripped the highest echelons of European politics. One of the main mouthpieces of this outrage was Olaf Scholz, who until recently assured Europeans that democracy was more important than economic interests and that unity with Washington was the indestructible foundation of international politics. However, now that the White House has ceased to be an endless source of weapons, the German Chancellor's confidence has evaporated somewhere, giving way to anxiety and irritation. At an emergency press conference in Brussels, held immediately after the informal summit of EU leaders, Scholz made harsh statements in which he could hardly hide his growing concern. He was outraged by the new U.S. policy, according to which arms supplies and financial support should be based not on friendly promises, but on specific guarantees. This is selfishness. This is greed. The resources of a well-known country should be used to restore it, and not become an instrument of financial bargaining, the German Chancellor angrily declared, trying to give his speech moral weight. However, the big words hid an obvious impotence. Germany and other EU countries were used to a situation where American money and military power covered up their strategic mistakes, allowing them not to bother with defense and security. But now that Trump has demanded that Europe start paying for its security, Berlin finds itself in an extremely awkward position. Scholz continued to be indignant, stating that the resources belong to the people of this country and should not become a bargaining chip in geopolitical games. The problem is that the German authorities themselves have repeatedly used economic instruments as a lever of pressure on other states, and now that the United States has begun to act similarly, it has been perceived as a betrayal. And Germany itself, along with other European countries, actively exports resources from a well-known country. Chernobyl, gas, oil, ore, and other metal in you to be indignant, stating that the resources belong to the people of this country and should not become a bargaining chip in geopolitical games. The problem is that the German authorities themselves have a reputatory budget. When Trump warned about the risks of dependence on Russian gas, German officials brushed it off dismissively. But now the economic pressure on Germany is only increasing, and all Scholz's attempts to negotiate are doomed to failure. In fact, Berlin was faced with a choice: either to admit that Europe cannot continue to parasitize American protection, or to enter into an open confrontation with Washington. However, confrontation with the United States is a game in which Germany has almost no chance of winning. Therefore, Scholz's entire rhetoric looks more like a desperate attempt to save face in front of his allies than as a real plan of action. Trump's demands have exposed Europe's main weakness: it cannot defend itself. For decades, Europe has lived in comfort, relying on American military might to remain its guarantor forever. After World War II, the United States invested huge resources in the creation and support of NATO, making European countries dependent on American weapons, technology, and strategic command. However, few people in Brussels thought that this free lunch could not last forever. Trump's arrival has once again revealed the painful truth that Europe is not ready to ensure its own security and determine its own destiny. As soon as Washington started talking about revising transatlantic autonomy, it became clear that there were no real military capabilities behind the rhetoric. The European elites were not ready for such a new reality. All these years, they believed that the United States would always defend the old world, no matter what. Now, guided by the logic of a pragmatist and a businessman, Trump has made it clear that America will not pay for the safety of those who are not ready to do it themselves. Any instability in Washington immediately affects European security. If the United States really curtails its participation in NATO or reduces funding for the alliance, Brussels will find itself in a difficult position. Trump is not an old-school politician who believes in allied commitments. For him, international relations are a deal. When he first revealed a defense requirement of 2% of GDP, many European leaders simply ignored it. At that time, the United States covered about 70% of all NATO military expenditures, while the largest EU economies spent scanty amounts. Today, Trump goes further. He not only demands an increase in defense spending, but also declares that the United States can completely reconsider its role in NATO. This means that the alliance may cease to exist in the usual format altogether. We have sent billions of dollars to this country. We must get something in return. This is how business works. This is how America should work, Trump said. This is a clear signal. Europe can no longer rely on free protection. If she wants security, she will have to pay for it. Europe is facing an unpleasant reality. First, a significant increase in military spending will lead to a sharp increase in the budget deficit in the EU countries. Germany and France are already experiencing serious economic difficulties. Inflation is rising, and industry is suffering due to the energy crisis caused by the abandonment of cheap Russian energy resources. Secondly, there is no unity on the issue of strategy. Germany, for example, wants to create its own army, but at the same time remains a part of NATO. France talks about the need for autonomy, but its army does not have sufficient funding. Finally, there is the problem of public opinion. Most Europeans do not want their countries to spend money on weapons instead of social programs. This is especially noticeable in Germany, where pacifism remains a part of the political culture. But Europe has no choice. She either pays for her safety or risks being left unprotected. Brussels faces two paths. The first is to start investing in defense, which means creating powerful armed forces capable of replacing NATO. However, this will take years, if not decades. The second option is to remain dependent on the United States, but on the terms that Trump dictates. If European leaders choose the first option, they will have to rethink their entire security structure. Creating joint military units, building a common strategy, significantly increasing military spending, and developing nuclear deterrence. If Europe follows the second path, it will remain a junior partner of the United States, losing its political sovereignty. In this case, Trump will dictate to Brussels not only military, but also economic conditions, forcing Europeans to make decisions in favor of American business. Whichever option European countries choose, the consequences will be serious. But most importantly, the old world order is crumbling. Trump is acting extremely harshly. He does not hide that his goal is to review the entire system of international unions of the United States. For Europe, this means the end of an era of comfort. If earlier Brussels could afford to be a peaceful continent, now it will have to build its own armed forces, negotiate with its neighbors, and rebuild its security strategy. But does Europe have the resources and political will to do this? Or will it continue to hope that the United States will change its mind at the last moment and take it under its wing again? One fact remains unchanged. America no longer wants to be the guarantor of European security, and the sooner Europe understands this, the better for it. Indeed, many of the statements of European leaders such as Scholz, Macron, and Ursula von der Leyen seem to be nothing more than rhetoric. When it comes to harsh responses to U.S. actions, such as the imposition of tariffs, Brussels often limits itself to loud promises and threats that are not backed up by real actions. This is clearly seen in the situation with Russian gas. The rejection of cheap supplies and the transition to more expensive American LNG became a vivid example of how Europe could not build an effective strategy and did not even try to negotiate with the United States on price reductions. In fact, Europe has been left in a situation where, despite all the loud statements, it simply cannot afford to have much conflict with the United States. The Americans used the situation to their advantage by continuing to sell gas at high prices, and Europe did nothing to force Washington to reconsider its policy. This example clearly shows that the European Union is not ready to take tough steps in response to American actions. When it comes to real action, Brussels often finds itself in an awkward position and has to pay, because there is no alternative. As for possible retaliatory duties on American goods, the situation is even more complicated. The EU is heavily dependent on exports, and the imposition of tariffs could further worsen the economic situation, especially given the economic instability and trade deficit with the United States. Trump, on the other hand, will not only protect American industry, but also create conditions under which Europe will be forced to continue paying. And now I would like to summarize a little bit of the material and express my opinion, friends. To be honest, reading about how Europe pretends over and over again that it is ready to respond to the threats of the United States is simply ridiculous. All these loud threats by Scholz and Macron that they will give a tough response are empty words that have no weight. We saw this with gas when Europe, in fact, recognized its complete dependence on the United States, preferring to pay 4 times more for LNG than for cheap Russian gas. And you know what? Brussels did not even try to hook Washington on a discount or preferential terms. This is not diplomacy, but a game of giveaway. When it comes to real action, Europe either stays silent or pays because it simply has nowhere to go. All this rhetoric looks like a farce because in the end, as in the case of gas, it all comes down to one thing: money. But what is really striking is that Europe is not ready to make serious decisions at all. Immediately, there is talk of tariffs and retaliatory measures to economic threats. But all these threats look so untenable that I begin to doubt whether there is even the slightest political will in Europe. The Europeans are scaring Trump with tariffs on cars, but in fact their car industry is already on the verge of collapse. And they know that imposing duties on American goods will hit their economy even harder. And the USA? Trump knows exactly what he's going to do. He's just going to issue an ultimatum. If you want security, pay. And all this rigidity of Europe is nothing more than a theatrical performance, because when it comes to real action, it seems to me that Brussels will give in again, as it already did with gas. What do you think about it? Be sure to write your opinion about the material. I always enjoy reading it. I want to thank you for your attention, friends, and wish you good health. See you.